Hello, Christian Ethics class, and welcome to Class 6. In this class, we're going to begin a two-class sequence in talking about good order, which really is the question of the relationship between the church and the state. And we've talked about this briefly in some of our introductory lectures, and we've noted that this question of the relationship of the church to the current temporal political order is one of the kind of big foundational questions in theological ethics. Now, we're not really going to be talking in this lecture about American constitutional law of church and state. We'll talk about some of that a little bit briefly in the next lecture. This isn't a constitutional law class, though. What we're primarily trying to do is give the theological framework for thinking about different perspectives on the relationship of church and state and how we as Christians ought to live in the world today in relationship to what we today call the secular state. Now, I said what we today call the secular state. I've mentioned a few times that I did, when I finished my doctorate this summer, I did it at the University of Nottingham, and one of the kind of important theologians who, until very recently, taught at Nottingham was John Milbank, and Milbank was one of my examiners, and Milbank, in his book Theology and Social Theory, really caused quite a stir a number of years ago when he published that book, and the first line of that book is, once there was no secular. And what he meant by that, and this became an important theme in a lot of contemporary theology and political theology, is the idea that our modern notion of some kind of division between sacred and secular is really artificial and is simply a product of modernity and is a very recent innovation that until very recently in most of human societies throughout the world didn't really exist. People, both outside the Christian West and certainly within the Christian West, had what we might call an enchanted worldview. And by enchanted, we don't mean sort of, pretty and delightful and enchanted. It may have been that at some points, it may not at other points, but the idea that what we today in modern terms call the supernatural, the divine presence, evil presence, and so on, pervade all of reality, and you can't tear those things apart. And as we'll see as we go through this a little bit, that really was true in Christian thought in many respects, again, up until some relatively recent thinking and theorizing about it. And as I mentioned, now there is increasing, I don't know about increasing, but there is theological pushback about whether that's the right way to think about it. So one initial thought about this might be to ask the question that our text asks, which is, how can the state be distinguished from the concept of society? Is there a difference between this concept of state and this concept of society? And the text suggests that one way we might think about this is that the state is a seat of political power and authority, whereas society is not in itself an institution. Society might include institutions, say an educational institution like a theological seminary, or an institution like the family, and so on. But society as a whole is much broader than the concept of state as a seat of political power and authority. So that's potentially one way to think about a possible distinction. The idea of the modern nation state, the idea that state as a seat of political power and authority is located within sovereign nations that have their own set borders and territories, that have their own ability to decide what forms of government they want to adopt, that have their own ability to decide matters of the relationship of the political authority and religion, whether there is no relationship or is a formal relationship. have their own authority to develop, use particular kinds of laws or have constitutional authorities. All of these are modern concepts, and we can most immediately trace those concepts back to developments that occurred after the wars of religion in the 17th century. If you take a church history class, you will study the wars of religion. And this is a period kind of in the immediate aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, and you've got a difficult intertwining of princes and kings and rulers with the religious authorities. And there had been a long history before the Protestant Reformation of the extent to which in the Christian West, which is where the Reformation occurred, the extent to which the papacy had authority over temporal affairs or only over spiritual or churchly affairs. And there was a lot of back and forth over centuries about that. And there were periods when the papal authority was very high, and there were periods when the papal authority was very low. There were periods when the papacy was divided. There were periods when the popes were in exile. And all of those sort of crises form actually part of the backdrop of the Reformation. Now, in the Reformation period, the magisterial reformers, Calvin and Luther and their immediate followers, made clear that secular authority, state authority, I should say, temporal authority, temporal governance still matters and still is ordained by God, but that the religious authority, and in particular the papacy, should not be able to exercise its authority directly over those state authorities. And, intertwined with all of that history were some princes who were, for their own political and economic and other reasons, very desirous of getting out from under any presumed power of the papacy. So some of those aligned themselves with Protestant factions. Others remained loyal to or aligned themselves with Catholic factions. And war raged throughout Western Europe. The 30 Years' War, which, by definition ranged about 30 years, was a completely devastating affair, as devastating in its time and in the consciousness of people in and around that time as World War I and World War II were in their times. Now, of course, World War I and II, in absolute terms, many, 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 many more people died. There was much more destruction. They were much bigger. The engines of war were much bigger. But kind of in relative terms, the 30 Years' War and other related wars really devastated the European people, the European countryside, European stability. And they eventually led to a series of peace treaties among these different Catholic and Protestant-aligned princes that are called the Peace of Westphalia. So this picture is from this painting is from the signing of one of those key peace treaties. So a couple of just terms that you ought to be aware of from the Peace of Westphalia. Now, one thing the Peace of Westphalia does is it goes back and honors an earlier peace accord from some earlier conflicts that had their roots in the same kinds of causes, both ecclesial causes and temporal causes relating to money and territory and things like that. But some of the key terms: each prince has the right to determine whether his state is Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. Those were, by the way, pretty much the only options at the time. And those were the basic alignments of most of the warring princes. So the prince can decide that question, and that is an enormous kind of concession, an enormous development from the prior history of Christendom in the West, which was always presumptively and politically Catholic. Minorities, meaning minority religious persons, meaning, if you're a Catholic in a Lutheran territory or a Lutheran in a Calvinist territory, under the Peace of Westphalia would have the right to practice their faith during set hours. The state would circumscribe the hours in which there could be official church services or in private. And there was a recognition of national sovereignty. So each of the particular territories ruled by these princes, which are making these determinations, are now beginning to be recognized as national sovereigns, with their own borders, with their own ability to decide forms of government, with their own rulers, with emissaries who had the right of letters of marque, in other words, diplomatic immunities when traveling back and forth through other territories. And this concept is really the root of our current concept of the nation state, the United States of America or Mexico or Canada or Russia or whatever, these separate states with their own laws and their own rulers. And it's also the beginnings of concepts of kind of modern concepts of international law as a form of law that kind of mediates between or adjusts the relationships among these different states. I do want to note one thing here. I say wars of religion in that third bullet point, and I do put that in scare quotes for a reason, because there's some really good scholarship in recent years. One of the writers mentioned in this chapter in our text is William Cavanaugh, and Cavanaugh wrote some important work on the question of whether the wars of religion were really about religion or whether they were really primarily about other kind of typical things that wars have always been fought about, territory, money, and the like. So there's a lot of debate in the scholarship about the actual cause of the wars of religion and whether it's really right to call them wars of religion. In the popular consciousness, in our own modern concepts, even in our own American constitutional law concepts of the difference between church and state, the wars of religion, the 30 Years' War and other wars around that period, still remain very important as a backdrop. So when we talk about the need to keep the state neutral in terms of religion to avoid a state going to war in the name of religion, this is a very important backdrop to that. So the historiographic question, I think, is really an interesting and important one. If you take my church history class, I talk about this some more. I mean, I suppose I personally hold, I'm not an expert in this period, but I personally hold somewhat of a position in the middle, I suppose. I think those wars were political in a classical sense, that is, they were about territory and money and power, but I think there also were religious passions that really fueled them. There was real hatred between and among many of the Catholics, Lutherans, and Protestants, and that certainly added fuel to it. And in any event, without doubt, it is a black blot on the history of Christianity that there were wars that couldn't be resolved in some other way. In any event, what I want you to see on this slide, and for the purpose of this class, is this concept of the state. So even our whole problem that we're addressing in this chapter, and this question of good order in contemporary terms, is in many ways a relatively modern problem that would not have occurred in precisely the same way during earlier periods. So what about those earlier periods? And we really, as a touchstone, again, certainly in the Christian West, we need to go back to Augustine again, and even look back at a part of one of the texts that we looked at as a primary source text a couple of weeks ago. Now we're looking at Augustine and part of the City of God. This is a fundamentally important text in political theology. We just don't have time in this class to talk a lot about the Christian East. Again, if you take a church history course, if you take my church history course, we spend a lot of time talking about these early centuries of Christendom and the fact that the Eastern Church and the Western Church relatively early on began to develop some of their own styles, some of their own thought process, and they were related to different political centers. The church in the West was related to Rome as an ecclesial and political center, and the church in the East was related to Byzantium as its political and ecclesial center. And those political differences in the early centuries of Christendom, there's sort of an ebb and flow between those political centers. There are even some times when is fighting, literal fighting between those centers. At one point during the Crusades, so there's a lot of tension. In 1054, there is the Great Schism when the Eastern Church separates from the Western Church. I mentioned the Crusades just a moment ago. Kind of in this period before the Great Schism, the various crusades are going on. The wars with Islamic forces and the rise of Islam in the further parts of the East, but impinging on the eastern part of Christendom, begin to really even further geographically and politically isolate the East and West. So there's an important traditions of political theology and thoughts about the state in the East. We could talk about the Emperor Justinian, for example, but we just don't have that much time to consider that. So we're going to focus mostly on the Augustinian legacy as our text does. So recall that we looked at an excerpt from Augustine's City of God, and this Augustinian definition of society, an assemblage of reasonable beings bound together by a common agreement concerning the objects of their love. And Augustine here is talking probably more broadly about what we today would call society, but he also is talking about elements of what we today would call state. Remember that in Augustine's kind of political view, there's not a sharp contrast between society and state. State governance, political governance, temporal governance kind of falls into this general question of society. Remember for Augustine that there's this city of man, this kind of current reality that we inhabit that is passing away and that is corrupted. And then there is the city of God, which is the coming reign of God, but which is already present in some way, and which isn't fully known, but which sort of co-inhabits the space right now with the city of man. So that's Augustine's kind of concept of how political order is relating to spiritual order and his broad definition of society. And, the book mentions John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, and I have a little picture of him down here. And I think the reason that the text emphasizes Newman is because thought like Newman's, like this, and this is, from the 19th century, but thought like this still remains very, very influential and important in wide varieties of political theologies, whatever direction they might take. And we might even say that there's kind of a broadly Augustinian tradition in political theology and then also in theological ethics that draws on concepts like this when it's thinking about how the spiritual order relates to the temporal order and how Christians ought to think about living in the world today. So notice Newman's definition here: a certain assemblage of beliefs, convictions, rules, usages, traditions, proverbs, and principles, some political, some social, some moral, and these tending towards some definite form of government and modus vivendi, way of living, or polity, as their natural scope. This, then, is the constitution of the state, securing as it does the national unity. So notice his definition isn't first about some kind of power that is imposed and that, sets rules that, could just be any old kind of rule. What he's suggesting is that from the corporate body of the people, the way that people live, the way that people speak, the things that people believe, all of that tends toward a way in which it makes sense, that it naturally makes sense for those people to be governed. And what the state does is reflect those values and secure those basic values. Now, Newman, writing as a British Catholic, he had been a British Anglican and then a British Catholic. I think you could gather from this a certain sense of the kind of British understanding of themselves, even in the 19th century. But even today, I think you'll see political theologians, again, like John Milbank, resonating with this kind of thing. In the American context, people who are Augustinian political theologians might refer more toward our constitutional tradition, whereas people in the British tradition might refer a little bit more toward how some of their social conventions cohere in a constitutional monarchy. But either way, right, the notion is there is this society that comes first, and from the society flows naturally the political authority. And notice also that the sense here is that if the society is rotten to begin with, then the political authority is going to be rotten. If the society has certain things in it that are worth preserving, then there are going to be things in the political authority that are valuable and even good, and that it's important to have preserved. So kind of how you think of what the political authority does is going to be important to this concept of what you think society is. As all of this suggests, I hope, one of the big questions, and this is one of the big questions we looked at even in the first class when we did the slide with the different nodes that we need to think about when we're thinking about theological ethics, is the relationship of the fall to the state. So how does the Christian doctrine that in some way human beings and human society are fallen, are sinful, are not as they ought to be, how does that relate to our concepts of the temporal state now, in the world we live in now, and what the purpose of that is? And how does that relate to our idea of what the temporal state was or would have been, if anything, had there been no fall? And how does that relate to what the temporal state will be, if anything, in the eschaton, when the city of God is all there is? So one way to think about the Augustinian view is the idea that the state and its laws are necessary only because of sin. And there are certainly some important strands in Augustine's thought and in Augustinian thought that say exactly that. Had there been no sin, there would have been no need for government. Had there been no sin, there would have been no need for any kind of positive law enacted by any kind of ruler. When there will be no sin one day in heaven, there will be no need for government or for law. And so that is one really important strand of the tradition. And what that does is it really pretty significantly relativizes the state and law. It suggests that any government is eventually passing away and is not a final good in itself. And that any law, any particular law or statute of a human being may do very good things, but is temporary and is not final and is passing away. Nevertheless, in the Augustinian view, the citizens of the heavenly city, that is, people who love God, even now, living in this world, might use and can use and should use the state and its laws as appropriate or necessary. In fact, the state and its laws are provided for the preservation and enhancement of the citizens of the city of God. But again, it's relativized. They must recognize that the state cannot establish true peace, that the state's laws cannot establish true peace. They can only do some intermediate temporary things. So the purpose of earthly peace is limited. Earthly peace may be important, but the goal of the Christian life in this view is not the securing of earthly peace. The goal of the Christian life is to use earthly peace when it may be available, to promote it as appropriate for the broader purpose of the advancement of the kingdom of God. So there's a separation between the idea of what the kingdom of God is in this view and what political order or legal order in this current world could be. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not the only way to think about these things. What we're going to do next class, in the next lecture, is we will talk about universal, subversive, and ecclesial ethics in relation to some of these different ideas. And you'll see that particularly in some versions of subversive ethics, there's a tendency to consider the kingdom of God to be comprised by, or at least to include, the current political order, that the reign of God could be realized in the political order now. Even in ecclesial ethics, there are some ways of thinking about political theology that relativize the temporal state, but that see the governance of ourselves within the body of the church, a different kind of governance, as the realization of the kingdom of God now. So there's going to be different, again, these are nodes that we can sort of pull on and think about different tensions and how these relate. I think the text gives us a good observation that I wanted to emphasize here. We might say, we would say, the Augustinian view would say, both that the powers that be are ordained by God, which is the locus classicus, the classical text, Romans 13, and the powers that be are powers of Antichrist, which is really the locus classicus in the text of the book of Revelation. And what I have up here are two pictures. The one, as you're looking at your screen, the one on the left is the Emperor Constantine, just a statue of the Emperor Constantine. And, so here's a very strong affirmation that the powers that be are ordained by God. If you can see in the picture, I'll put my cursor over it right here, you can see the sword, right? Constantine is wielding the sword. So there's that very strong affirmation of that. This other one is just an engraving of the depiction of the whore of Babylon from the book of Revelation. And so the whore of Babylon is, riding this seven-headed dragon, and the kings of the earth are supplicating before the whore of Babylon because they want her wealth, they want her power. And the way the Augustinian tradition tends to read the book of Revelation is metaphorical, and that metaphorical reading would be that the power of temporal rule is corrupting. So this is a tension that any kind of Augustinian view is certainly going to have to hold. The state is relativized, and yet, and the state even tends toward corruption and dissolution, and yet the powers that be are ordained for certain purposes by God. Now, the Augustinian view always remained influential and important, and as I said, it's influential and important today. As the text mentions, in the kind of the medieval period, even though Augustine remains hugely influential, there tends to be a kind of more positive view of the role of state, the state, and in particular of the role of the king. And what I have up here are a couple of quotes from Thomas Aquinas's treatise on kingship, and you see a picture of Aquinas there. And you remember we looked at some passages from Aquinas. He's a hugely important medieval scholastic theologian. Now, part of the historical background, I think, for thinking like this is that Christendom sort of consolidates. There are writers like Aquinas who are writing within very well-established Western Christian states, and they are trying to kind of talk about why there would be a Christian king, right? So if Augustine is right, and the state is kind of passing away, and the state tends toward corruption, why would there be Christian kings? Now, Augustine certainly thought there could be Christian kings. I don't want you to get the impression that Augustine's view of the state was that, like, some kind of proto-Anabaptist, like Christians can't be involved in it. Not at all. But just in its kind of emphasis underneath, you can certainly see a bit of a shift in tone and in thinking. And, again, I don't want to suggest Aquinas is disagreeing with Augustine in a very direct sense here. I mean, Aquinas, in his writings, very often refers to Augustine as all of the medieval scholastics did, and simply assumed Augustine was an authority. If he was going to do something different, he would nuance it. But I just want you to see the kind of somewhat different tone here. And also notice what Aquinas is saying about human nature. So Aquinas says, in this first quote I have here on the left, human beings cannot live alone. Some animals, Aquinas says, do live alone, and they're designed to live alone. And if each human being could do that, each human being could be his own king and could sort of report directly to God. But human beings, Aquinas said, are naturally social creatures. So here Aquinas is drawing on this theme of sociability that you do see in Augustine, but in a somewhat different key and in a stronger way, saying nature gives to human beings. Human beings are created for sociability. We cannot be our own kings just reporting directly to God, because that's not the kind of creature we are. So then in this treatise on kingship, Aquinas goes through a variety of different potential forms of governance. And what he settles on is the notion of unity. And he says, and this quote on the right, the effective government is the one that keeps the unity of peace. That's the most useful one. That's the one that best promotes human society and sociability. The end, notice this reference to the end. What he means by the end is not the end of all things like eschatology, but he means the goal, the telos, the thing toward which everything is directed, right? This is a very Aristotelian idea. So what is directing us more toward human flourishing, toward what Aquinas calls happiness? And by happiness, he doesn't mean sort of our idea of maybe happy-go-lucky, but he means being as we are made to be, really in fellowship with God. And he says that can only be done through unity, and one ruler more effectively brings about unity than others. And he gives an example here of heat. He gives other examples from nature later on in the text. And so he concludes the rule of one man is more useful than the rule of many. And then he goes on in this text to talk about what a proper Christian king ought to be like, about when a proper Christian king, or when a king is really not being properly Christian, but is acting as what he calls a tyrant, and so on. But just notice here this really fairly positive appraisal of the fact that a temporal king is a bit more than just provisional, but is part of the telos, part of the ordering of human beings intrinsically to their final end. Kind of moving rapidly through some historical periods, we can think about the Reformation. There's a lot of contemporary scholarship about the Reformation and its effect on political theology in its own time, as well as its effect on political theology and political thought today. I mean, one of the big themes, I think, in a lot of that literature is the notion that the Reformation kind of gave rise to ideas about or promoted ideas about individualism. So whereas Aquinas said the individual can't be just a person standing before God, the notion is that the Reformation actually brought out the suggestion that no, in fact, an individual can be an individual standing before God. There's some truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. But what I want you to notice here is that the magisterial Reformation, we say the magisterial Reformation, we mean the reformers who did not reject the legitimacy of temporal government. We will look a bit more next class at the radical Reformation, and in the radical Reformation, there's, in many cases, an outright rejection of temporal government. But Martin Luther, John Calvin, those who followed after the two of them, did not reject temporal government. In fact, they thought temporal government was rightly ordered and ordained by God, and that it had its own important purposes. Now, the text goes into a little bit some of the differences between Luther and Calvin. We don't need to spend too much time on that. But I just want you to notice this quote from Luther's open letter to the Christian nobility of the German nation, which we're going to talk about together in class. So, see, Luther is talking about here this class of persons in his society that are supposed to represent the spiritual estate, the priests, bishops, popes. And then he's comparing them to other people in society, cobbler, a smith, a farmer, and so on. And he's suggesting that all of them have a spiritual vocation. Why is he doing that? We'll talk about this more in class. But what he's suggesting is that temporal rulers have a spiritual vocation. So this is, in many ways, resonates with what Aquinas said about the Christian king. But there is a sense in which Luther and also some sense in which Calvin are making this a little bit more, I don't want to use the word democratic, that would be an anachronism, but a little more common than perhaps it was in prior thought. Okay, and this really gets us up to the beginnings of the modern period, or gets us back to, I guess, because we talked about the Peace of Westphalia. So it gets us back to kind of the modern period. And what I want you to see here, and this is a quote from Thomas Hobbes, who is a philosopher writing in the 17th century. And what happens in this period of the Enlightenment is that political philosophers like Hobbes are trying to come up with theories of governance and the state that don't rely on kind of the prior Christian doctrines, the Augustinian view or the Reformed views, and that don't rely on sort of religious dogma. But in doing this, they have to, come up with some justification for the state, for governance, for rules. Because one response might be, well, if we're going to kind of do away with prior ideas about the governance of God, then why have governance at all? And if you're going to do that, whenever you're going to do that, I think, you're going to have to think about, well, where does this need for, if we have a need for this kind of organization, where does it come from? You're going to have to look back to sort of founding myths, if I can use that term, for where humanity comes from, for where our nature comes from where our inclinations come from, what we were like before there were formal systems of government, if there was such a before. And so Hobbes does that famously in his book Leviathan. And what Hobbes says is that, and this is in a sense sounds kind of a counter-Augustinian note, because he says the notion that there was a period when human beings lived in harmony is false. Now remember, the Augustinian view relies on the notion of a fall. There was a period when Adam and Eve lived in harmony with each other and God, and they fell from it. But Hobbes says that's not really the case. Hobbes says human beings need some power to keep them in awe. Because if they don't have a power to keep them in awe, to keep them in check, they will pursue their own self-interests. And he calls that condition war. He doesn't necessarily mean by this, formal declared war, although that would be included. And notice what he says. The kind of state of nature is a time where every man is enemy to every man, which means that men live without security, other than their own strength. If you live in that kind of state, he says, there's no room for industry, there's no room for culture, there's no room for navigation, for travel, there's no room for buildings, there's no room for construction, all of the human cultural goods that we value, no arts, no letters, no society. There's no room for any of that, he says, because everyone's just out for themselves. That's our natural condition. And this is, a really famous quote. And in that state, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, this is a really interesting way of framing it because Hobbes is writing, well before Darwin. Hobbes didn't know of Darwin's theory of natural selection, and he didn't know of the kind of modern view of the development of nature through processes like natural selection, which, at least in one way of thinking about them, do assume that organisms are out to sort of preserve their own species and promote their own self-interest. But certainly these kind of ideas relate to the later Darwinian ideas and still remain really, really important in a variety of ways of thinking about political theory. And in particular, if we are trying to think about political theory in the light of what the natural sciences tell us about natural history, about how we deal with that history and that background. Now, I should say, just not to leave a misimpression, modern theories about evolutionary sociobiology and so on don't necessarily always assume that all interactions are purely selfish. There is a notion of altruism which is really important in those theories. That notion of altruism, I think, is nothing like the theological or philosophical concept of love. Nevertheless, there are notions of cooperation and so on. It's a very complex area. It is something I'm really interested in. But what I want you to see here is how this is part of the modern story, that our natural condition is to be at war with each other. And however we kind of work through the sciences in relation to theology and so on, I think at least, that's not the biblical story. That's not the Christian story. The biblical and Christian story is that we human beings are part of God's creation, that God's creation is good and that God's creation is very good with the creation of human beings. And again, however we think about the doctrine of the fall and how literal it is or how not literal it is, take my theology and science class in the spring. We'll talk about all those things and we'll have fun talking about them graciously. But it is still part of our understanding of humanity, that there's something that is not as it ought to be, and that our most natural state, so to speak, is really our created state, which is harmony with each other and with God. So when we think about political theory and theology, we're dealing with these modern ideas, and even when we're thinking about the nation state and the modern order of the nation state, not that we necessarily would want to do away with that, but there's going to be parts of it where I think Christian political theology and Christian theological ethics are going to say, well, that's making assumptions that aren't necessarily correct, or at least that come from a different sort of framework or background. So I just want to highlight that for you, and we'll pull that out. All right, the last piece that I want to do in this lecture is just highlight the concepts of justice that are mentioned in the textbook on page 222 to 223. So whenever we're talking about these questions of right order, of the state, of governance, of law, we're always ultimately, I think, invoking concepts of justice, of how ought human beings be in relation to each other. And when we think about that, that invokes the idea of justice. So in kind of the contemporary literature of thinking about the question of justice, I think the textbook does a good job of laying out these different areas. So you have commutative justice, which is the idea that how goods owned between individuals, like business transactions, ought to work. If I give you a pig, what should you give me in return, right? $10, a chicken, whatever. Contributive justice, what does each individual owe to society for the common good? Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, kind of thing. Distributive justice, what does society owe to each of its individual members? Can it be that some people have a lot more of basic resources than others? Or if some people have a lot more, should that be redistributed? When would it be just for some people to have a lot more and some people to have less? How much less? Those kinds of things. Legal justice, which is the rights and responsibilities of citizens to obey positive laws promulgated by the sovereign, to honor each other's rights and the rules that protect the peace. Retributive justice, which is the idea that if you have broken the law, there's some kind of retribution or punishment, and what should that be? And then finally, this concept of restorative justice, which is, as the text notes, an important recent concept, which is the idea that if someone has broken the law, if someone has upset the justice of society, the goal shouldn't be so much retribution as it should be the restoration of that person back to the functioning community. So these are some ideas of justice. We're going to take a lot of this history we just talked about in class on Thursday. We're going to talk in a bit of detail about Martin Luther's very important letter to the German nobility. We're going to talk about these different categories of justice. We're going to run through a few examples. And then that will set us up for next week when we will again look at this question of good order. We will look at some really important contemporary theologians, again coming back to one of my favorites, Karl Barth and the Barmen Declaration during the Nazi period, Martin Luther King Jr. and some others. So this is the end of the lecture, and I will see you on Thursday.